Welcome to the Evacuation Planning, Training, and Exercise course. The objective of this training is to assist hospital staff in planning, preparing for, and carrying out the multifaceted process of hospital evacuation. In this course, we will address the background of hospital evacuation planning, the process to be carried out, and the connectivity of the evacuation plan to the overall Hospital Emergency Operations Plan, or EOP. We will explore the preparedness phase of the Comprehensive Emergency Management Program relative to an evacuation and define many of the core concepts. First, it's important to understand some background. Hospitals are required to establish and maintain effective evacuation plans. These requirements come from two sources: the accrediting authority, such as the Joint Commission, and the National Fire Protection Association standards. The NFPA standards represent industry best practices that should be incorporated into the hospital's emergency management program. Additional statutes, regulations, or requirements may be specified by state or local licensing agencies, such as the State Health Department. Internal fires, hazardous materials events, utility failures, hurricanes, and human threats are some of the most common incidents forcing a partial or complete evacuation of a hospital. Historically, most facilities paid modest attention to evacuation requirements. They would typically be addressed briefly as a component of the fire safety plan, and the described plan would end once occupants were outside the building. Hurricane Katrina changed this perspective following its devastating strike on the Gulf Coast in 2005. The hurricane caused levees in New Orleans to fail, and the subsequent flooding resulted in a great loss of life. Hospitals and nursing homes that had not evacuated were impacted, and many patients died in their healthcare facilities. After Katrina, authorities began paying considerable attention to the evacuation plans and capabilities of hospitals and other healthcare facilities. Subsequent events have continued to reinforce the need for evacuation preparedness. The contemporary best practice for comprehensive emergency planning is for an organization to create an All Hazards Emergency Operations Plan, or EOP. The All Hazards EOP describes how the organization responds to any crisis incident or event. The organization then creates subplans called annexes. Annexes document hazard-specific considerations, procedures, response actions, or support activities to be taken for or in support of a particular high-vulnerability event, such as severe weather or a hazardous material incident. The document containing evacuation procedures is properly known as the Hospital Evacuation Support Annex to the All Hazards EOP. This annex is applicable to any hazard identified in the hospital's hazard vulnerability analysis that may force a hospital to evacuate partially or completely. Within the hospital, it is typical for one department to serve as the facility's lead for evacuation. This may be the facilities department, the safety and security department, or any other. The proper department should be assigned by leadership to take responsibility for the evacuation planning effort. Once a lead department is established, the process continues by assembling an evacuation planning team, receiving input from various clinical and non-clinical departments, such as administration, communications, discharge planning, emergency management, facilities, fire or life safety, human resources, legal, materials management, medical records, medicine, nursing, pharmacy, purchasing, security, support services, and transportation. This team is responsible for developing, reviewing, validating, refining, and maintaining the Evacuation Support Annex. While many of these participants may serve on the hospital's Emergency Management Committee, it is suggested that the Evacuation Planning Committee function as a dedicated subgroup, as the details are complex and will require significant focus. After all, evacuation may be the most profound action that a facility can take, especially under crisis conditions. Planning for it requires the full attention and support of key leaders, as well as appropriate funding to acquire necessary equipment, conduct training, and perform other activities. In order to develop a meaningful evacuation support annex, its development should be based on a realistic, worst-case scenario in which the hospital needs to rapidly evacuate the entire facility with limited staff and no off-site communications capability. The evacuation support annex is utilized when the scope of an event, such as a flood, loss of utilities, or extreme weather, exceeds the facility's ability to maintain an environment of care for its patients. First, the hospital administration or other authority having jurisdiction declares all or part of the facility unsafe or unusable, requiring a partial or full evacuation. Controlled discharge procedures are enacted to reduce inpatient census by approximately 15 to 20% in order to free up additional resources for evacuation. Whenever possible, patients are transferred to a facility that provides similar services at the same or increased level of care. As well, efforts are made to keep patients in the community, close to friends and family. As time allows, transferring facilities should notify the State Department of Health and local EMS about their change in treatment status. Initially, patients to be evacuated are placed in designated surge holding areas. Placement in receiving facility beds will come as time and census permit. Therefore, patients will need to be sent with medical records, urgent supplies, medications, and in some cases, equipment such as beds, monitors, infusion pumps, and ventilators. Use non-ambulance transport methods such as ambulettes, school or transit buses, or even taxicabs for non-critical patients when feasible. The hospital coordinates patient destinations, bed availability, resource needs, and information sharing with local and state partners via existing processes and technology. At the onset of the evacuation event, the hospital may send minimal staff to the receiving facilities. Staff from the evacuated hospital will then function under the direction of the receiving facilities management. At the outset, these staff members will remain on their original payroll and benefits programs. Other financial arrangements between the hospital and the receiving facilities are assessed at the time of the event. Receiving facilities will make further patient dispositions based on the best interests of the patient. Once the hospital has resumed normal operations, the receiving facilities agree to return any of the hospital patients who are willing and able, as well as any of the transferred equipment. A hospital should undertake a number of preparedness measures to improve their readiness, should the need for relocation or evacuation arise. The process begins by creating a three-dimensional rendering of the entire hospital, including all floors, departments, and units, to help planners better visualize the hospital, evacuation routes, entry and exit points, and so forth. This computer-generated model also helps map out staging and holding areas. Next, planners should establish a routine process for identifying the typical number and locations of ambulatory and non-ambulatory patients by unit and building. Having this information will make it easier to know at a glance what resources are needed to evacuate a specific area. It's also important to recognize occupants that require special needs and assistance, such as those with physical or cognitive disabilities. Having a frequently practiced status reporting process for gathering this information in an emergency ensures that such data is readily available and current when needed. In the event that technology or automated information is not accessible, consideration should be made in developing paper forms of all patient medical and tracking records. To quickly reduce inpatient census, the hospital should develop early discharge procedures. This development may require the assistance of social services and other outside agencies. A memoranda of understanding with nearby skilled nursing and other alternate healthcare facilities may be needed during an evacuation to temporarily house early discharge patients. Next, the hospital needs to designate specific staging areas where patients will be held prior to transport. These should factor in possible inclement weather and might include areas such as the hospital's parking garage or other location where vehicles could be staged when arriving to transport discharged patients. To safely and effectively move patients to these staging areas, project the numbers and types of staff required in advance based on the typical census in the hospital. Enact staff notification and recall procedures. This is likely addressed in the hospital's emergency operations plan. In addition to personnel, a hospital needs to identify supply and medical needs with local vendors, such as pharmaceuticals, medical and non-medical supplies, equipment, and food and water. To evacuate patients, a hospital needs to inventory and procure an adequate number of stretchers, wheelchairs, and other patient evacuation devices, such as stair chairs and evacuation sleds. Training and drilling should also be in regular use. A well-prepared organization finds a way to integrate this practice into common activities. For example, they might ensure that each fire drill includes an evacuation segment, where the fire response team arrives to find some sort of simulated patients needing movement to an alternate location. Ongoing training, drills, and exercises prepares staff to respond rapidly to facility emergencies, such as fire alarms or internal chemical spills. Training also prepares staff to properly contain threats, thereby minimizing the need for relocation of occupants. Often, a quick and effective immediate response, such as controlling a small fire with an extinguisher, limits a problem and prevents the need for more extensive actions later. Hospitals should consider 4 levels of activation in the Evacuation Support Annex, which correspond to the 4 levels of HICS activation often used by hospitals in their emergency operations plan. The hospital EOP levels include Level 4, an alert phase based on a threat or warning of an event that has not yet impacted the hospital. Level 3, a minor impact phase, based on an event that is having a localized, minor impact on a single unit or small area of the hospital. Level 2, a moderate impact phase, for an event that is impacting about half of the hospital, while the other half is able to continue normal operations. And Level 1, a major impact phase, for an event that requires the entire focus of the organization to manage. The evacuation levels of activation are designed to correspond with the overall EOP levels, and they are selected based on the projected impact that the particular evacuation would have on the hospital. The urgency of the evacuation level, planned, urgent, or emergent, is based on the general amount of time available to plan for the evacuation and mobilize the necessary resources. A best practice is to develop 4 levels of Evacuation Support Annex activation based on the following criteria. Level 4, Alert for Potential Evacuation. This is used when information is received indicating a situation or event that may require relocation of patient care or ancillary service activities from all or a portion of the facility. For example, a National Weather Service issuance of a blizzard, hurricane, tornado, or flood watch or warning, or an activation of the fire alarm with no confirmed fire. Level 3, Limited Area Horizontal Evacuation. This is used when there is a need for horizontal evacuation of patients, visitors, and staff from an area of a building. For example, when a fire is in a single room, this type of evacuation would require occupants of that space to move to an adjoining smoke compartment. This is the more common hospital evacuation scenario, which is typically handled by the staff on duty in the affected and adjoining areas, possibly assisted by arriving fire and emergency response team members. This can be accomplished quickly using resources such as standard wheelchairs and patient beds that are already in place or readily available on the unit. Level 2 activation requires vertical evacuation of a limited area of the facility. Level 2, Limited Area Vertical Evacuation. This type of evacuation involves the need for vertical evacuation of patients, visitors, and staff from one floor of a building because of an event, such as a smoke condition, that affects an entire floor. In this scenario, the impact on the organization increases significantly because of the need to move patients downstairs. The planning assumption is that the elevators are not usable. This requires considerable additional manpower and specialized equipment for patient movement. Level 1. Large area, entire building evacuation. This level indicates the need for complete evacuation of patients, visitors, and staff from multiple floors or an entire building for an extended duration. This may be required in a situation such as an uncontrolled fire or failure of a mission-critical system, like electricity or environmental controls. The threat is such that it may only be mitigated by evacuating the building and moving all patients, staff, and others to temporary locations as quickly as possible. These could include other buildings on the hospital campus or alternate facilities. At this point, any alternatives to evacuation have been considered and communicated to the Unified Command Group as unacceptable. Education and training with regard to the Evacuation Support Annex can be delivered through many avenues, but there are 3 core levels of evacuation training that should occur in the hospital. These include evacuation awareness level training, evacuation management level training, and evacuation task and product-specific training. Hospitals should also perform evacuation-specific scenarios with competency development. Click on each kind of training to reveal its requirements. In this course, we have presented the process of planning for an evacuation, including the key components of an evacuation support annex, appropriate planning assumptions and preparedness measures, plan activation criteria, and receiving facility guidelines. In addition, recommended practices for low-impact evacuation training and exercises were also presented. In subsequent courses, we will address incident management and evacuation logistics in greater detail. Forms will be used in the patient loading areas to verify onward destinations and mode of transport. Remember that all of today's technological systems originated with paper systems, so any of them can readily fall back to paper-tracked systems if technology is not available. Most patients' personal property, other than prosthesis or assistive devices, will not be transported during a brief evacuation. It will be left behind, safeguarded by the hospital, and returned to the patient once the hospital is reopened. Hospital plans should specify the process to track the arrival of each patient at their predetermined ultimate destination. They should also specify the plan for patient repatriation to the original facility when the hospital returns to operational status. The tracking form used should contain key patient information, such as their medical record number or identifier, indication as to whether or not the original chart was sent with the patient, the time the patient left the facility, and the name of the transporting provider. In addition, the form should include a list of medications sent with the patient, whether or not the family has been notified of the transfer, and their contact information. As conditions evolve during an evacuation, give consideration to relocating several incident facilities. Establish an alternate hospital command center, as well as a public information area and labor pool area at the receiving facility that is closest to the transferring hospital. This will expedite the evacuation, recovery, and repatriation processes by enabling the command and control element to remain operational without interruption. In this course, we have presented the role, focus, and functions of incident management in the process of hospital evacuation, and continued with the functions of incident communications, staff mobilization, and patient tracking. In the final training course, logistical considerations specific to hospital evacuation will be presented.